Hello, historians. Today we are going to talk about slavery, which is not fun, but it is part of American history. We can't avoid it. This could be upsetting or depressing or both. With slavery, every time you think like, oh, it couldn't have been that bad, it turns out to have been much worse. Slavery was hugely important to to America and the whole interconnected American economy. It led to a civil war, and it lasted, in terms of U.S. history, it's a long time. It lasted 246 years of human slavery in America, and eventually the United States. It lasted from 1619, when the slaves were first brought to Virginia, to 1865, the end of the Civil War. But slavery is important too, because we still struggle as a country with its legacy. So this class might not be fun, but it's certainly very important to know about, to learn about. So the slave-based economy in the South was vital to the whole American economy, not just the Southern economy. Without Southern cotton, the North wouldn't have been able to industrialize so quickly, because it was cotton textiles, cotton cloth, that were the first industrially made products in America. The cotton was the most important commodity in world trade by the 1800s, by the 19th century, and 3/4 of the world's cotton came from the American South. Cotton shipments overseas made Northern merchants rich. Okay, this isn't just about the South, all right? Northern bankers financed the purchase of the land that would be planted with cotton, with the plantations. Northern insurance companies insured slaves for their owners. Why would you need to insure a slave? Because they were property, and they were very valuable property. Historians often refer to slavery in America as chattel slavery. Oops. All right, I'm going to do that better. Here we go. There are various forms of slavery throughout history and around the world, but in America, chattel slavery is how we refer to the form of slavery we had here. Chattel, that word, means things you own. So chattel slavery, and it usually refers to things like livestock. You know, your horses, your cows, your pigs, those are your chattel. But in terms of chattel slavery, it means that one person has total ownership over another person. In addition, back to the economy part, to turning cotton into cloth to sell overseas, Northern manufacturers sold the cloth back to the South, where it was often used to clothe the very slaves who had cultivated it in the first place. Certainly the most prominent effects of a slave-based economy were seen in the South. The profitability of slave-based agriculture, especially what they called king cotton. All right, king cotton was the crop. It meant that the South is going to remain largely rural and agriculturally based economy-wise. Slave states were home to very few cities, no big cities, and with the one big exception of New Orleans, because it was a port, which allowed, it was America's main port on the Gulf of Mexico. Almost all of the cities, the urbanization in the southern states, happened in the most northern parts of the South, if you will. Cities like Baltimore, farther away from the more agricultural life of the large cotton plantations. Also, slave-based agriculture was so profitable that it pulled money, it siphoned money away from other economic endeavors. There was very little industry growing in the South. The South is producing only 10% of manufactured goods in America, while slavery still existed. And as most of the money that is free for use in the South, what they call liquid money, free for use, was being plowed into the purchase of more slaves. There wasn't much being spent on technological innovation, like, for instance, railroads. They weren't building railroads. So this lack of industry and the lack of railroads are going to really handicap the South during the Civil War. Ultimately, that's good because it ended slavery, but it was difficult for the people in the South at that time. So, in short, slavery dominates the South, shaping it economically and culturally. And slavery is not a minor aspect of American society. By 1860, there are 4 million slaves in the United States. 4 million slaves. And in the South, they make up a third of the population. 1 out of every 3 people in the South is a slave. And in some places like South Carolina, African American slaves outnumbered white Americans. So slavery was not just a few places and a few people. It was a lot in a lot of places. So, sometimes we, kind of in books and in our popular imagination, we think about plantations kind of like James Madison's house, Montpelier, right? These sprawling affairs, giant land, hundreds of slaves. But in reality, the majority of slave owners only owned 5 or less slaves. And there were many white people in the South who owned no slaves at all. And sometimes people in the South that they could afford to would rent slaves for certain times of their harvest or planting that were more labor intensive. Those were called yeoman farmers. Yeoman. Smaller farms, mostly living self-sufficiently. They're not purchasing much, in town or in a marketplace or anything like that. They are self-sufficient. They raise their own food. They usually work the poorest land, and so they get the least amount of yield from that land. And so they were pretty poor themselves. But even they were largely supported by slavery, partly because they supported slavery as the institution of slavery. They thought it should continue to exist for a number of reasons, partly aspirational reasons. I can make enough money, become a farmer that can own slaves of my own. There are racial reasons. It means that you're higher class than someone else. Instead of being the lowest, poorest class, you have more legal and social status, even as a poor white, than any slave in your mind ever could. We know many of the founders, we remember they held slaves, and they saw slavery as, let's use the phrase they used, a necessary evil. They called it that. They said it was evil, but they didn't know how to get rid of it. Like Thomas Jefferson said, we have a wolf by the ears. What if we let go? So we have, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Okay. So they have justice on one side and self-preservation on the other. And the belief that justice and self-preservation have to be one or the other are kind of opposed to the whole American ideal that they established. And in the end, it's going to make the Civil War inevitable. As slavery becomes more entrenched with these ideas of liberty and political equality, some Southerners begin to make the case that slavery wasn't just a necessary evil. Instead, they start trying to argue that slaves benefit from slavery because, their masters feed them and give them clothes and take care of them until they're old, maybe. And yet, in reality, what we see with the actual lives of slaves is that they make every possible effort to get their freedom. This, what we call paternalism, like this fatherly sense, allowed slave owners and masters to see themselves as benevolent, as good fathers to their slaves, and to contrast that, these people having to work in northern factories, it's breaking up families. They don't get to all be together all the time. Looking back at the horrors of slavery, we shake our heads and say, how could they say such a thing? But when you live every day with an evil that you see as necessary, you begin to look for ways that you can feel better about the fact that you are owning and exploiting human beings. So there's all this criticism all over the North especially, and in some parts of the South. And this is where we get this idea that we're going to argue that the institution of slavery is actually good for the social order. Okay, we keep things balanced and we keep things running smoothly with this, what they called the peculiar institution of slavery. Not them, other people called it that. So one of the best known, I'll call him a bad guy, one of the best known bad guys of this view, had held this view and spoke about this view, was John C. Calhoun, a Southern politician who in 1837 said this in a speech on the Senate floor: "I hold that in the present state of civilization, there are two races of different origins and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual differences. When they are brought together, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two, instead of an evil, is a good, a positive good, because two peoples, one black, one white, from one African, some American, right? It's good that we set it up this way to make one superior and one subservient, one owned as property." So John C. Calhoun, he was nobody important, right? He was just a fringe politician. Nobody took him seriously, right? Well, not really. He was actually the Secretary of State from 1844 to 1845. He was the Secretary of War from 1817 to 1825. And you're like, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, big deal. Who pays attention to that? Well, he was the Vice President from 1825 to 1832. So he was an important American politician who believed that slavery was a necessary good to keep two races apart from each other. People also justified owning human beings as property with biblical passages and with examples from the ancient Greeks and Romans, and sometimes just, straight up racism, that black people are inherently inferior to white people and keeping them in slavery is the natural order of things. I hope that is bothersome to you. It bothers me, okay? So here is the truth about slavery. It was coerced, forced labor that relied upon intimidation and brutality and dehumanization, taking away a person's humanity. And this wasn't just a cultural system, it was a legal system. Louisiana law proclaimed that slaves owe their masters respect without bounds and absolute obedience. It was a legal system. And the whole reason, the whole point of slaves' lives was work. Work and work only. And, the conditions and the task varied, but all slaves labored, usually from sun up to sundown. And if you were a house slave, you might still be slaving long after your masters have gone to bed and be up earlier than any of them. All of this was done with pretty much no pay, except in extremely rare circumstance. Pretty much nobody was paid. This was free labor because you were owned. Okay, most slaves, the vast majority of slaves, worked in agriculture, farming, on plantations or farms, smaller farms. And the conditions were different, though, depending on which crops were grown wherever the slaves lived. On rice plantations in South Carolina, the working conditions were pretty terrible. When you think about the heat and humidity and the way rice has to be harvested, it was very difficult work. But in South Carolina, they also labored under what was called the task system. That meant that once you had completed your allotted daily work in the fields, you now had to spend any extra time you had doing other tasks for your master. We can't think of this the way we think of, we have work time and leisure time, okay? Because you have to bear in mind they were owned and treated as property, and leisure and relaxation aren't part of that economic equation. The more they work, the more they profit, the owner. Now in cotton plantations, mostly slaves worked in what they called gangs, in groups, usually under the control of an overseer, or another slave. A trusted slave might be put in that position, and it was called a driver. Picking cotton under the southern sun is back-breaking work, and it was mostly cotton plantations where we see a lot of whippings or threats of whippings to get slaves to work. It was necessary to threaten them to get them to work. It's easy to talk about slave brutality, but it can be difficult to really internalize it, to really understand it for real. Now, attached to the email that has this video, there are pictures of slave brutality situations. And they can tell the story of the cruelty, but they don't always communicate how strangely arbitrary it was. There is a story told by a woman who was a slave as a young girl, and she said, "The overseer went to my father one morning and said, 'I am going to whip you this morning,' my daddy told us. He said, 'I ain't done nothing.' And the overseer said, 'I know it. I'm going to whip you to keep you from doing nothing,' and hit him with that cowhide whip. You know, it would cut the blood right out of you with every lick if they hit you hard." Okay, so this slave was whipped to make sure he didn't do nothing. He didn't take any rest or leisure time, because this is all part of this process that I call dehumanization. You have no control over your time. You have no control over what you do, when you do it, how you do it, where you do it. We control everything because you aren't human. You are our property. We own you. You are subhuman. You are more like our horses and our mules. I just want to talk for a second about horses. Horses in the state of Virginia, in particular thoroughbred horses, which are, they know their bloodlines of these horses and they go back a long time. If you purchase or you own a thoroughbred horse in Virginia, there are records that will tell you the sire and the dame, the mother and the father, I hope that's the right terminology, I'm not a horse person, but of every horse that's a thoroughbred, all the way back to when those horses were brought from England to the New World. The records are so thorough. Now, for contrast, if you are an African American and you want to trace your genealogy, there's no record of your ancestors. If they were brought over from Africa on a ship, there is no record of when they left Africa, what ship they were on, where that ship arrived, who they were sold to, whether they married, whether they had children, whether they were sold off to another farm or plantation. No records. There is records of on plantations of in the census records, right? When they take this, you have to name every person that lives on your property. And so slaves were listed strictly as male and their age, female and their age. Sometimes it would say laborer, sometimes it would say house slave. It would say what their position was, but no names. No names, no birthdays, nothing like that. So if you are an African American person and you want to trace your ancestry, your genealogy, there's no records. You might know because your great great grandmother came from this plantation in this year in freedom from 1865, because after 1865 now there are records. So many African American people can only trace their roots to 1865, to the Civil War, and the rest is just kind of blank. And so I just want you to see, but if you have a thoroughbred horse, their genealogy is known all the way back to when they were sired in England, back in the 16 or 1700s. That was the value. I want you to see a thoroughbred horse, keep every possible record so you can justify the value of your horse. African American human being, no record, just their age and whether they're male or female. That's all the records. What value did we place? How are our values so disrupted, so off base? Okay, so let's go back, all right? So the brutality, the whippings, the brandings. Slaves that tried to escape when they returned were often branded. That means they took a hot iron, heated it up till red hot in the fire, and pressed it into your skin to brand you for life as belonging to that owner or farm or plantation. Slaves that attempted to escape regularly sometimes would have half of one of their feet chopped off to prevent that from happening again. Just bring out the axe and chop off part of their foot. Okay? African American slave women were often raped, often many times. They often bore children to their owners or their owners' sons. The brutality. This was a brutal life. No freedom, punishment for no reason, no authority over your own body. They could do whatever they wanted. Okay? All of that is real. And it was intentional, because in order for slavery to function, the slaves needed to be dehumanized. They needed to be less than human. This enabled the slave owners to say, it's okay that I own slaves because they're not really human. They're not fully human anyway. I can be comfortable with thinking of them like my animal property, which comes where that term chattel slavery comes in. So the idea that slave owners wouldn't think of their slaves rather as human, and hopefully the slaves wouldn't think of themselves as fully human. But it didn't work. Okay? Slave resistance to dehumanization took many forms, but one of the main ways was that they formed families. Family was a refuge for slaves and a source of dignity that the masters saw. They recognized that and they wanted to stifle that. And a slave owner named Bennett H. Barrow wrote in his rules for his plantation, "No rule that I have stated is more important than relating to Negroes marrying outside of the plantation. It creates a feeling of independence." And they're not supposed to be independent. They're not supposed to be independent humans. So most slaves did marry unofficially. They couldn't officially marry. You might have heard of the jumping the broom ceremony. There would be a preacher among their population, and they would be married by the preacher, and then they would bring out a broom and they would jump over the broom, and that was like their official, we're now married. They often married for life. Usually they married for life, and when possible, they tried to raise their children together. But single parent households were common because often one of parents was sold. In the upper South, where the economy was shifting, like in Virginia and North Carolina, from tobacco to less labor-intensive cash crops, they began to sell slaves more often. The sale of slaves became more common, and they estimate that maybe 1/3 of slave marriages in states like Virginia were broken up when the husband or the wife was sold away to another owner. Religion was also a very important part of life in slavery. Masters wanted their slaves to learn parts of the Bible, parts that talked about being happy in bondage, things like, and being honoring their masters. Slaves in their worship time tended to focus on the stories of Exodus, where Moses, brought the slaves out of bondage, or the biblical heroes who overcame great odds, like Daniel and David. Most slaves were forbidden to read and write. It was illegal, but many of them did it anyway. And some of them became preachers. And slave preachers were often very charismatic leaders, and that aroused the suspicion of slave owners, and not without reason, because some of the most important slave uprisings in the South were led by preachers. An escaped slave named Joseph Taper wrote, "Since I have been in Canada, I have been well contented. Man here is as God intended he should be. That is, all are born free and equal. This is a wholesome law, not like the Southern laws, which puts man made in the image of God down on the level with brutes. Oh, what will become of the people, and where will they stand in the day of judgment? What would the 5th verse of the 3rd chapter of Malachi were written as with a bar of iron and a point of diamond upon every oppressor's heart, that they might repent of this evil and let the oppressed go free." I put the scripture verse from Malachi on the email that this video is attached to, if you want to go ahead and read that, or just look it up in your Bible. But Joseph Taper showed that one of the primary ways that slaves resisted their oppression and their dehumanization, he ran away. No one knows exactly how many slaves escaped to freedom, but the best estimate is that 1,000 or so a year journeyed north. Most fugitive slaves were young men, but the most famous runaway slave of all is probably Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman escaped to Philadelphia at the age of 29, and over the course of her life, she made about 20 trips back into Maryland to help friends and relatives make the journey north on what they called the Underground Railroad, the way they moved slaves from state to state with these safe houses that were all stops on the Underground Railroad. And maybe you remember when I was at the Dismal Swamp Canal that we talked about the fact that that was a stop on the Underground Railroad, because the myth that it was haunted and there were demons living in the Great Dismal Swamp was spread, and on purpose. And so most whites would not go into the Great Dismal Swamp because it was evil, and there were devils and demons there. And so it was a great hiding place for slaves on their way north. But another more dramatic form of resistance to slavery was actual armed rebellion, which was attempted. Individuals sometimes took matters into their own hands and beat and even killed their overseers or even their masters. That said, large-scale slave uprisings were rare. The most successful rebellion was Nat Turner's in Southampton County here in Virginia, August 1831. Sorry, I lost my place. Oh, Turner was a preacher. Just like we said, they led many of these uprisings. And he led this uprising with about 80 slaves, and they marched from farm to farm, killing the inhabitants, the white inhabitants. Turner and about 17 other rebels were captured, and they were executed. But not before they struck terror into the hearts of whites all across the South. That, unfortunately, had negative consequences, because Virginia's response at that time was to make slavery worse, passing even harsher laws that forbade slaves from preaching, prohibiting them from even learning to read, and other slaves followed Virginia's lead. And by the 1830s, slavery had grown even harsher. So this shows that large-scale armed resistance wasn't just suicidal, it was also a threat to your loved ones, in reality to all slaves. But we still need to emphasize that slaves did resist their oppression. Sometimes it meant taking up arms, and it usually meant more subtle forms of resistance, because they didn't really want to have the people they left behind hurt. So they would do things like intentionally, subtly slow down the work, or maybe break the equipment, or pretend they don't understand the instructions that they're given. So and so most importantly, in the face of legal and cultural degradation, they reaffirmed their humanity through their families and through their faith. So why is that important? Because too often in America, we still talk about slaves who failed to rise up, when in fact rising up would probably have made it worse for them and their families, and probably would have meant their death and the possible death of people they loved. The truth is that sometimes carving out your identity in a social order that constantly says you are not even human, that's the most powerful form of resistance. Refusing to become the chattel, the animals, the property that your masters believe you to be, that is what made slavery difficult to maintain and the Civil War inevitable. So make no mistake, slaves fought back to maintain their humanity because that's what humans do. All right, I will talk to you again on Thursday. Check out whatever else is in this email so you don't miss out on anything. And I will talk to you Thursday. Bye for now.